video contains a trigger warning for generational violence and deportation. Prioritize your own self-care. There is so much fear surrounding the mass migration that is coming from Central and South America, and today I want to take some time to share some facts of American history that I think are missing from the conversation. I want people to understand that migrants are coming from these regions because of things the United States did to their countries. We describe them in ways that portray them as takers, abusers of our systems, and blame them for the problems that we have. We demand them to be worthy of the United States, using them as political pawns, victimizing them, showing them in need of our help, our pity. In the United States, we portray this as the ultimate search for the American dream. But we need to stop and ask ourselves, why is the United States of America the only place that is allowed to have dreams? I am Dr. Megan Benavides. I have a master's degree in Spanish linguistics and literature and my doctorate in education, and I specifically completed my dissertation on migration in Central America. In 1856, American filibuster William Walker declared himself the leader of Nicaragua. Because of the way the Senate works, he wanted to add Nicaragua to the U.S. state to expand slavery into Central America and increase the number of votes in the Senate for slavery. Nicaragua was strategically located because of the San Juan River to build a canal that could also help people cross over during the gold rush to California without having to risk the journey across the Rockies and Native Americans who, were defending their land against invaders. While not the U.S. Army, he was hailed as a hero when he returned to the U.S. He was defeated by Costa Rican and Nicaraguan forces in the Battle of Santa Rosa, which is today a national holiday both for Costa Rica and Nicaragua. This is not to mention that he did this after he lost in 1853 trying the same shit in Sonora, Mexico. In 1898, after the Spanish-American War ended with the Treaty of Paris, the United States just decided to colonize Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba. Now, the United States had started their support of these areas under the generous pretenses of saying, oh, we want to help you overcome the Spanish colonizers like we did the British. In the end, the U.S. just became the new settler colonizers. This is the same time, by the way, that we forced Mexico to give us all of this land. In the late 1800s, but really up to today, the United States created banana republics. Not the clothing store, well, but actually not the clothing store. Basically, the United States companies like the United Fruit Company were completely supported by the U.S. government. I mean, like literally the U.S. sent troops to protect plantations and took over Central American countries, completely stealing their natural resources and completely demolishing rainforests, forcing people to work in slave-like conditions. Some of the most famous authors in Central and South America, like Pablo Neruda, Carmen Lyra, and Carlos Luis Fallas, all became famous for decrying the octopus that was the UFC. In 1915, the U.S. occupied Haiti. They told the American people that this was to prevent anarchy, but we have evidence that President Woodrow Wilson only took action after the National City Bank of New York, which had significant financial interest in Haiti, convinced them to do so. U.S. Marines killed more than 11,500 Haitian people and really destabilized Haiti's political and economic situation. In 1916, the U.S. occupied the Dominican Republic to protect U.S. financial interests. In 1929, Mexican Americans are blamed for the Great Depression. Because of this, over 1 million Mexicans are deported, 60% of whom are legal U.S. citizens. In 1933, the United States supports the Trujillo dictatorship in the Dominican Republic. Rafael Trujillo was the brutal military leader of the Dominican Republic from 1933 to 1940. Unfortunately, the United States supported Trujillo because they feared communism would take over the island nation. Trujillo used horrible means of torture and killed off those who disagreed with his policies. The exact numbers are unknown, but approximately 13,000 to 20,000 men, women, and children were murdered in the attempted racial genocide of Haitians in the country. The United States CIA ultimately assisted in the assassination of Trujillo in 1961 and established a pro-American democracy without really ever apologizing for contributing to the problem in the first place. In 1952, the U.S. supports the brutal Batista dictatorship in Cuba. This guy was eventually overthrown by Fidel Castro. In 1953, again, Mexican and Central American migrants are blamed for decreasing wages. They implement a policy called Operation Wetback. 1 million immigrants were deported at this time. Unfortunately, migrants in cages, not a new thing. In 1954, the CIA helps overthrow the Guatemalan government in Operation PB Success because the democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, who ended the Guatemalan Revolution, was unfriendly to U.S. business interests. Remember bananas and coffee. The U.S. instead installed the lovely, sarcasm, military dictatorship of Carlos Castillo Armas, who made Guatemala a very friendly place for the UFC. Dictator Ubico is often compared to Adolf Hitler, so great guy. In 1964, the United States supports a coup d'etat in Brazil. Democratically elected president was overthrown by the United States because he identified as a communist. I like Noam Chomsky's quote here: the United States is selectively anti-fascist and always anti-communist. It isn't about protecting people against bad leaders, it's protecting businesses. Remember how I told you the United States led a coup d'etat in Guatemala in the 1950s? Well, a Guatemalan civil war followed in 1960, and unfortunately, the United States donated military aid, equipment, and training to the Guatemalan army during this time. In 1966, this became what's known as the Mayan genocide, killing off many civilian indigenous populations. We know at least 200,000 Mayans died during this time, but the answer is probably more. It would take until 1999 for the US government to acknowledge and apologize for their involvement in supporting these extremist groups. In 1971, the US declares a war on drugs. Rather than treating this like a disease and appropriately dealing with this on the home front, drug use becomes criminalized, and there's a whole other side of this to the US and how this disproportionately affected communities of color. I want to focus on places like Colombia and Venezuela that were completely destabilized by the efforts to bring drugs to the United States. This really escalated gang-related violence in the entire region. In 1972, the United States assists in the coup d'etat of Chile. If it wasn't so awful and terrifying, this pattern would be boring. In the 1970s, the United States was terrified of communism in the Americas. As a result, the CIA covertly spent $3 million campaigning against leftist candidate Allende. They ultimately aided in Chile's coup d'etat in 1973 to stop the nation from becoming another Cuba or the threat of a good example, and instead instituted, you guessed it, the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. In 1976, the United States develops a corporate tax loophole in the Puerto Rican economy. The US government allows businesses in Puerto Rico to avoid paying corporate taxes. It is not hard to see that if you have a huge corporations on a relatively small island, that this would be bad for that island. While this might seem like an obscure moment in history, these laws still create problems in Puerto Rico. These laws eventually crashed the Puerto Rican economy, and subsequent loan payments forced Puerto Rico to put repaying debts to the US over funding social services like schools and hospitals. In 1980, the notorious MS-13 gang was formed not in El Salvador, but in Los Angeles in the good old United States. After the United States destabilized places like El Salvador during the Contra Wars, these migrants fled to the United States and formed the MS-13 gang to both benefit financially from the drug trade as well as protect their own community against rival gangs. Rather than dealing with this gang problem on our own, the United States deported the MS-13 members back to El Salvador, where it was allowed to grow and thrive. Today, El Salvador is one of the most violent regions in the world because of similar gangs. In 1983, the United States sends 30,000 landmines to Nicaragua as part of the Contra Wars. These were part of President Ronald Reagan's campaign in Nicaragua to stop the Sandinista communist government. The landmines killed and injured thousands of people, many of them civilians. 7,000 are estimated still to be buried in Nicaragua, making some parts of the country still uninhabitably dangerous decades after the war. Aren't landmines a war crime? Yes, they are. In 1986, the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, found the United States guilty of supporting Contras in their rebellion against the Sandinistas and putting mines in Nicaragua's harbors. The court wanted the United States to give reparations to Nicaragua, which the United States promptly did and apologized for their involvement. Just kidding, of course they refused to participate in the proceedings. There could be a whole 5-hour video on just US involvement in Nicaragua, but let's turn to Honduras. Honduras was used as a staging ground for the troops that it sent to Nicaragua, really destabilizing the entire region. The US literally trained Contras on torture. We have their manuals. Additionally, the Contras imported crack cocaine into the United States. It's unclear if the United States was really that stupid and had no idea where these drugs were coming from, collaborated with the Contras to destabilize Black and brown communities by importing crack cocaine, or just wanted to look the other way so that the Contras would continue to support their anti-Sandinista efforts. Either way, not great. Long time, US sugar companies had completely taken over places like Hawaii, places in the Pacific, Asia, Central America, and South America. But I specifically want to focus on the Caribbean. American sugar companies began to take over places like the Dominican Republic. At one point, 25%, a quarter of the Dominican Republic, is owned by US sugar companies alone. Now, sugar is a notoriously difficult crop. It causes splinters and irritation. It causes long-term damage to your lungs. On top of that, the US has rampant slave-like and child labor conditions on their own plantations in places like the Dominican Republic. Even though child labor and slavery are illegal in the United States, the US does not prosecute organizations that are from the US who are doing these things in other places, and that continues absolutely to this day. And before we think this is liberal propaganda, let me bring us to number 19. In 2014, people started calling President Obama deporter-in-chief. That is right, the ultimate advocate of DACA forcibly removed more than 2.5 million people in his time. And this is way more than Trump, given any calculations. Now, to give the Obama administration some credit, Obama had 2 terms and Trump had only 1 term. However, I want to focus on the fact that Trump was overtly xenophobic and racist, while the Obama administration made a lot of pathways for citizenship, which is great. However, this allowed them to engage in mass deportations without the same level of social pressure that Trump faced. And now, number 20, the one you knew about and are waiting for, President Trump takes migrants coming across the border and separates families, putting children in cages. Putting migrants in cages is nothing new. Neither is mass deportations. However, what is different about Trump is that he focuses heavily on families and using family separation as punishment. He also massively increases xenophobia. I personally had a student in my classroom who was separated from his mother at the border at this time, and he did not speak for a year. It is like his childhood was robbed from him. I hope you understand the role that the United States played in the reason that these migrants are coming. Comment out of 20 how many of these events you already knew about before watching this video.